Chapter 1. The Market of Forgotten Souls. The twin sons of Corvith dragged their heat like chains over the Carrion Promenade, a slab of fused starship hulls and slag city bones that the traders called a marketplace and the moral called a ruin. Haze swam above the stalls. The reek of engine coolant, electro-tanned leather, and boiled sugar fruit braided together until scent became a kind of static that crackled between one heartbeat and the next. A chorus of languages rose like crows and fell again. Clipped clicks from insectoid tongues, the slow whale song of pressure-suited Bathanauts, the machine-perfect trills of broker drones spitting lot numbers and reserve prices and disclaimers about compliance tags and indemnity clauses. Children hid behind bales of netting while their elders fixed ocular implants and grinned with chrome gums. Even the wind sounded bought and sold here, funneled down ventilation shafts, shoveled through turbine lungs, taxed with each breath by the racketeers who owned the air. And in the middle of all this, in a rust-streaked cage whose bars had been bent once and then hammered straight again by someone who refused to admit the world could deform, sat a girl no one wanted, for the simple, devastating reason that she did not present as profitable. She was too thin in the way that speaks of the body paying forward to the future on credit it can't afford. Too still in the way of creatures who have learned the economy of motion the hard way. Too quiet in a place that rewards fear with immediate reprisal and the pretense of obedience with a few seconds extra life. Her eyes were a contradiction, though luminous, reflective like noctilucent plankton, the sort that swallow light and return it revised, as if the universe writes a first draft of itself and she edits in silence. Her name tag, if a flaking strip of paint counts as a name, read Lotvire. 9. Species marked as unverified subsapient with anomalous biometrics, which was a convenient way to say we can do what we want because we pretend she can't disagree. But of course she disagreed, and the disagreement lived in those eyes, and in the way her hands were not open in supplication, but folded like a technician parsing a schematic of the horizon. I moved through the market as one more man selling or buying something, my coat bleached to a color between sandstorm and old parchment, my boots glued back together with a resin I cooked in a stolen galley, my mind cataloging angles and exits and the rhythm of enforcer patrols. I had come to Corvith for parts. That was the pretext stamped in the paperwork I bricked together from 3 different identities and a crime I did commit years ago, and 2 I did not. I needed a quantum sump for a ship that had once been called honest work and now answered mostly to curses and coaxing. The sump would keep her core from hemorrhaging computation into the void, would stop her dreams from leaking through the bulkheads at night, would let her plot a jump without tasting iron and panic. But need has a way of changing shape when it sees a mirror. I saw the girl before I saw the sign, before the broker drone rotated its screen toward me and pitched the lot with a voice pitched to be neutral and came out gleeful anyway. I saw the quiet, the too still, the folded hands, and the way the cage's door had been hammered straight again by someone who believed bars could remember their duty if you reminded them hard enough. This was not my business. I am a mechanic, a pilot, a man who keeps engines from dying and people from getting too close. I fix problems I can measure with calipers and torque wrenches and diagnostic arrays. And in exchange, I am allowed to avoid the kind of problems that climb inside your chest and start rearranging the furniture. But there is an equation that lives in everyone who ever held a wrench at midnight and whispered to a machine like a priest at a sickbed, an equation that balances cost against consequence, and it does not care about the handsome lie called neutrality. I did the math and discovered I had already begun walking toward her. The broker drone sensed interest and unspooled a script, its screen stuttering through recordings of the girl in different lights, overlays of spectral data, an annotation that said, bioluminal ocular anomaly cosmetic or useless, a footnote about neural quiet that reduced a mystery to a defect. I ignored it the way you ignore someone's insult to your friend's laugh. I knelt not to her, not to the market, but to see it eye level and asked, in a language no one had used on this world for 100 years, if she had a name she preferred. The guard laughed, a wet wheeze that belonged to lungs seasoned with ammonia and shoplifted smoke. The girl blinked once, the way of creatures who measure their responses like money in a war, and said in a voice worn but intact that her name was Leo, then added after a beat, as if making room for it, Leo Verescent. A surname born of necessity because the universe insists on last names when it intends bureaucracy, and sometimes you choose your own for armor. The broker quoted some absurd price, then halved it when he saw my coat's threadbare cuffs, then doubled it when he recognized my eyes as the kind of eyes that would pay anything rather than leave. I did not haggle. There are moments when negotiation is a smaller kind of violence. I said 3 words, felt them hit the air like tools set on a bench, not dropped nor displayed, simply present. I'll claim her. The market has ways of making sure it understands who owns what. A needle and a passport chip and a tax, a ledger entry that grinds a soul into rows and columns and calls that proof. I offered none of those. I presented a writ of reclamation, old law from older wars, invoked not to possess, but to repatriate displaced property that once belonged to a shipwrecked vessel under human charter. It was a relic, absurd, sanctified by dust. It was also binding, here, now, because the mercantile syndicates of Corvith discovered long ago that ancient law is the cheapest law to enforce. The guard protested until 2 syndicate arbiters drifted over like weather and reminded him his outrage was not only unbecoming, but unprofitable. I signed my name on a cracked screen with a stylus that once belonged to a customs officer who had mistakenly thought his courage could not be pawned. I said Leo Virescent is under my protection, in a voice that neither shouted nor asked permission. And in the moment the cage door opened and refused to swing closed again, even when encouraged, the market seemed to take a step back, like a crowd feeling the ground tilt under it. Leo's eyes met mine with a gravity that felt like an oath spoken in the language of tides. She stepped out, not stumbling, not running, simply choosing a vector, and I realized that claiming and freeing can be the same motion if your hand loosens immediately after it acts. We departed before the market remembered what it was. The route back to my ship still called honest work in my head, and that poor thing, by the dockmaster cut along the edge of a boneyard where obsolete mechs rusted among flowering wires and playground weeds. Leo walked a half step behind, reading the air in front of us like a page. She asked no questions, but cataloged everything. The flicker smear of surveillance lenses, the compensated hiss of the pressure differentials near the berth gates, the way my left boot dragged on the right toe because the adhesive was failing. At the gangway, she paused, lifted her head in that animal way that says there is music just beyond hearing, and whispered a greeting. Not to me, to the ship. Honest work answered by flickering the running lights in a sequence I had never taught her, the kind of playful acknowledgement you see between old dogs who meet in a park and decide, without sniffing, that they will be friends. I felt something like embarrassment, the way you do when your house introduces you to a guest by revealing the poems it keeps in a drawer. I said, "Welcome aboard." And in saying it, I meant it all the way down to the bones, and the ship hummed in a tone that meant she approved of my manners. And Leo stepped onto the deck with the posture of someone moving not into captivity, nor even into safety, but into a place that will tolerate her becoming. Chapter 2. The ship that learned a new name for home. Ships are like cities if cities could kiss your pulse from the inside. They have neighborhoods you avoid and alleys that surprise a laugh out of you, and doors you leave locked not because they hide monsters, but because they hold memories that haven't learned to live outside yet. Honest work had been a cargo scow before I found her, then a smuggler's riverboat in vacuum, then a rescue vessel for all of 6 weeks before it broke my heart, then my house, then my penance, then my friend. Her spine was a graft of 2 different drives that learned to breathe in counterpoint. Her skin patched with plates from 3 navies and 1 refit yard that used to stamp blessings into the metal before soldering it on. Her navigation array was an antique that dreamed in maps with edges unrolled. Her kitchen a gravity-stubborn rectangle that offended coffee mugs and delighted soup. She ran not on fuel alone, but on improvisation and indulgence and affection. If you have never loved a machine beyond its use, if you have never whispered to one because it understood silence better than you, then I can only say that I pity your education. Leo explored her with eyes that translated the word explore into communion. She did not pry. She listened, and the ship spoke. She found a humming in a bulkhead, leaned her head against it, and announced that one of the coolant lines had developed what she called a lonely resonance that would, if unaddressed, become a rattle and then a crack. She located a dead space behind my bunk where the air pooled in a lethargic spiral and suggested we teach it a new trick by installing a vent shaped like a question mark. She spoke in metaphors about systems the way poets talk about weather, and I understood enough to realize that she was not guessing, or if she was, the universe had conspired to make her guesses diagnostic. I asked as gently as I could where she had learned such listening. She replied as carefully as someone testing a step on a glass bridge that her people had called it vasal, which translates roughly to the art of hearing the second song. Most of us hear the first song, the thrum of a drive, the whistle at a hatch seam, the harmonics from a stressed beam, but vessels and engines, and even planets sing and echo under that when they are in conversation with themselves, and some ears are shaped to receive it. The market had called her neural quiet, and in that criminal euphemism I recognized a gift that had scared someone who could only weaponize abilities they understood. In a better galaxy, Leo would have apprenticed in a ship monastery and been taught to tune arcworms for seed colonies or to calibrate cathedral engines for pilgrimage fleets. In this one, she had learned to be still so that a boot would pass by her without noticing. Honest Work noticed her. Within 20 minutes of boarding, the ship presented Leo with a warmed panel in the galley the way a cat presents a square of sunlight, and Leo sat there and closed her eyes and listened to the second song. And when she opened them, she told me the coordinates of the closest junk ring where we might find the quantum sump we needed, and I decided to pretend I believed it was luck, because sometimes luck is gratitude in a coat. We lifted from Corvith under the kind of scrutiny that says come again so we can hurt you later. The stars took us back like an estranged family trying their best. You can tell when a ship is happy in the way she holds a vector, the way the hull stops complaining, the way the drive's whine settles into a note that sounds like work done with pride. Honest Work had not been this calm in months. I adjusted yaw with a thumb, pitched us up toward a lane where traffic becomes rumor, and released a breath I didn't realize I'd paid interest on. Leo did not sit in the co-pilot's chair but on the floor with her back against the base of it, one palm flat to the plating as if reading a pulse through a wrist, and when I asked her if she wanted a harness, she smiled with the strange, luminous humor of people who have survived bureaucracy and said the ship would not throw her. We drifted into Long Burn and made soup, because that is what you do when you are not entirely certain the future has forgiven you yet, and you want to give it something to smell like kindness. I took the chance to draw lines around our situation. No contracts, no expectations of service, no debt ledger, only the practicalities of spacefaring and the necessity of sleeping and eating and taking turns listening for alarms. Leo looked at me a long time and then answered that she had no practice being owed nothing, but she would learn, and perhaps the first lesson would be to tell me when I was worrying inefficiently. I told her that worrying was sometimes the only form of currency a person can spend when they cannot change a thing, and she nodded as if I had defined a principle of physics that explained someone's favorite bruise. The junk ring Leo had named was exactly where she said it would be, a torus of refuse and relics, ship ribs and appliance guts, and a cathedral bell that must have rung the vacuum during some grand procession and then broken free to orbit a silence it could not fill. We skimmed its edge like a beetle along a pond, dipping our landing pincers into clumps of debris, tasting for mass density differentials that might hide a sump. Leo conducted a listening more than a scan, pointing once, then again, then shaking her head like a musician saying not that one. The second violin is a little flat. The third point was good. We netted a panel and cracked it open in the lock, and there it was. A quantum sump with the analog liver spots of age, but the elasticity of a dancer who never stopped stretching. I held it like a newborn and apologized to it for the places it would have to fit. We installed it together, me with torque and she with tuning. When we powered it, the ship made a small sigh, and then the navigation array bloomed with a clarity that punched tears into my eyes before I could decide not to be sentimental. With the sump installed, Honest Work could think as fast as she felt. She would no longer bleed guesses into deep time. I told Leo she had given the ship back her nouns, and Leo laughed, the first unbroken laugh I had heard from her, a sound that made the kitchen brighter in its own memory for hours afterward. That night, or what passes for night in the regulation of shipboard lighting, we ate fruit that dissolved like frost on the tongue and told honest fictions. I said I was from nowhere in particular and made a list of coordinates that would not triangulate to anything real. She said she was from a place they called the province of pencil lines, because it lived on maps, but never in flesh, a frontier designated for later that never arrived, a boundary between obligations. She had been stolen the way people are stolen when their lack of papers is blamed on them rather than on the machineries that grind papers into bones. She had not belonged to one master so much as been passed between subcontractors, leased to problems as a cheaper sort of instrument, and each time she demonstrated the art of hearing the second song, the price they asked for her went up, and the value they placed on her narrowed to a trick. I did not ask if anyone had been kind, because kindness in a place like that often disguises a receipt. I told her instead about engines I had loved and engines I had forgiven, and one I had buried in a canyon with her lights burning still, because she refused to die if I kept watching, and how I left rather than command a miracle into cruelty. Leo listened with her whole face, and then said that perhaps the most honest work we do is to teach the objects we love that they no longer need to plan for abandonment. We jumped at dawn ship time toward nowhere in particular with our somethings in order, but tranquility is a state the galaxy taxes aggressively. We intercepted a distress call on the far edge of the junk ring, the kind of clipped emergency transmission that comes from someone who has already counted and found their seconds too few. A convoy of refugees, a word that in the mouths of the syndicates translates to liabilities, had been clipped by an unlicensed mine cloud, their lead tug hemorrhaging power, their tow cables whipping like severed nerves. We did not debate. There is a calculus that cares little for the numbers, and it solved itself inside us. We burned hard, our sump's fresh mind carving a path that minimized debris, and arrived to find a site that bent the heart. A cluster of pods butting their noses together like cold animals, a tug bleeding light, and behind them the shapes of ships that watch and wait for scavengers' luck to turn carrion into currency. Leo wasn't looking at the convoy at all. Her head was cocked to one side, as if listening to a whispered nickname. When I asked, she said someone on one of those pods was singing the second song in ragged patches, a rhythm she knew as intimately as a scar. I looked at the registry list and saw an impossible coincidence become the kind of narrative the universe uses when it wants to test your thesis. The pod in question had been routed through the Corvith market 2 weeks earlier, its cargo lists redacted, its owners killed by a typo. Leo's face closed like a hand around a candle and then opened again with a decision. We extended the coupler and whispered in our own second song, the one that says, "Hold on, we are coming." The scavengers edged nearer. I killed our transponder and lit the ship with the old rescue code of the first convocation, a pattern no pirate wants to attack because it suggests the kind of retribution that arrives wrapped in law and fire. They peeled away like sullen weather. We caught the pod. The tug died. And in the moment our coupler sealed like a kiss meant to save a life, I understood that bringing Leo aboard had been not a kindness, but an invitation to become the version of myself who did not leave. Chapter 3. The second song of revolt. The pods we caught belonged not to a convoy with a plan, but to a tide with a hope. Families nested inside luggage that used to be houses. Elders cradled heirlooms like sleeping birds. Technicians argued with prayer flags about whether the universe gave more weight to boldness or redundancy. The pod Leo had heard was small, built for 6, currently holding 11 and one machine that had been half melted and then rebuilt with love and wrong screws. The machine had a face because someone had believed faces are how we tell the truth to one another. It bore the shorthand of a maintenance servitor, but hummed in a key I had not heard since I stood on the deck of a shipyard as a child and listened to a new vessel discover her name. Leo knelt in front of it, as if greeting some old teacher she had once defied. She spoke, not in words, but in that careful quiet, and the servitor roused like dawn in a pocket, and the people in the pod made the sound of weeping the way machines sometimes vent steam when they're overpressured with joy. The servitor's tag read ORPHUM/PR3, which someone had softened with paint into Orphe. Leo called it brother without moving her lips. Later she told me that she and this machine had been paired in a repair camp on the edge of a ring world no one remembers now because remembering costs bandwidth, that they had learned together to tune the second song in pipelines and domes, that they had been separated when Orphe refused to optimize a water system beyond a threshold that would have poisoned the soil for 3 generations. I shook the hand of the elder who had kept Orphe operational in exile, and she smiled with all her teeth and none of her bitterness and said, "We keep what keeps us. We towed the pods in a stagger and repaired what we could until the problems felt like family rather than doom. We couldn't house them long. Honest Work was loyal but not elastic. But we could shepherd them to the nearest shelter at Kestrel Point, a listening post turned sanctuary by a consortium of monks who had discovered that prayer offered alongside soup nourished twice. Pirates gnawed at our wake but kept their distance, worried by the rescue code and the rumor that sometimes behaves like armor. We thought we were improvising a mercy, and then discovered we had wandered into a war drawn small enough to fit in our pockets. The syndicates who ran Corvith did not like their assets self-rescuing. They broadcast a bounty not on us by name, but on any ship matching our mass that had been seen escorting pods believed to contain expropriated inventory. They sent enforcers dressed as charity and charity dressed as enforcers. We misled them with old tricks and a few new ones louder than honor and quieter than cowardice. Leo spent hours in the engine room teaching Honest Work to hum particular chords that made our emissions look like the aftertaste of a mining barge rather than the flavor of a freighter with opinions. Orphe limited his power, so the pod would register as harmless if scanned. The refugees shared stories in low voices that never once used the word slave, even though the shape of that word sat between us like a bruise we refused to mistake for skin. We did not name it because naming can sometimes freeze a thing in place. Instead, we named specific tyrannies and specific debts and specific acts of love, and in specificity, we found room to move. At Kestrel Point, we docked to cheers and suspicion because that is how communities survive when they cannot afford faith as a default setting. The monks met us with bowls and medkits. We offloaded the pods, and each family stepped onto deck with that stunned relief that resembles grief when viewed from the wrong angle. Kestrel had beds and a library. It had a choir of broken radios that the monks had taught to sing together every evening, and the sound stretched like a net across the station so that anyone drifting too far might hear and remember where to come home. We might have left then and written the rest of the story as a tidy braid of gratitude and fuel receipts, but the syndicates arrived an hour later with a legal team shaped like a blade. They served Kestrel with papers claiming possession of persons. They dressed theft in fonts that meant seriousness. They flourished seals that had once been used to verify grain shipments and now verified exploitation. The monks told them to leave and were answered by a promise to cut their life support one wire at a time. Someone older than Patience asked me, quietly, if my ship could sing loud enough to change a mind. Honest Work could not sing that loud, but she could carry a song to someone who could. The convocation fleet kept a hearing court 3 jumps away on a station named for a river that never existed. There, old laws napped until someone woke them up and poured tea in their cups. The writ of reclamation I had used at the market was a key to that court. In its clauses lived not only provisions for property, but the echo of a principle that predated trade. Persons cannot be owned, and if you find the paperwork arguing otherwise, you have found not law but loot with ink on its face. The trick was making a court listen before the syndicates severed Kestrel's breath. Courts listen faster when shame is a public spectacle. Monks are allergic to spectacle. Refugees are tired of being anyone's lesson. That left mechanics and machines, and those who had learned to hear second songs. Leo proposed not with heat, but with geometry that we hijack the syndicate's own enforcement relay and convince it, briefly, that it had received a validated subpoena from the convocation demanding an emergency review. The relay would not obey long. It would, however, hold fire while it checked. In that pause, we could transmit a packet that included recordings of the market, testimonies from the pods, signatures from the monks, and a kind of music that only outlaw accountants understand. A ledger showing the flow of credits through shell companies back to the very court that would be forced to ask why its own administrators were profiting from bodies. It was more than a hack. It was a second song sung into the wires that made them vibrate with conscience. Orphe blinked his status lights in a pattern that meant, loosely, delicious. I said only that if we failed, the syndicates would turn us into parts and sell us back to ourselves, which is a fate I object to on aesthetic grounds. Leo smiled in that precise way that means she has already done the first step while you were listing reasons to be afraid. We launched the operation at midnight station time, when enforcers yawn and systems perform their quarantine updates, and the people who write malice into code take their shoes off and think themselves safe. Orphe handled the ingress, brute forcing nothing. instead offering the relay a handshake with the right calluses, a greeting wearing the perfume of a trusted certificate. Honest work carried the payload like a prayer folded into a pocket. Leo sang to the relay, or rather to the echo under it. The rhythm of maintenance cycles, the barely audible delay in its audit pings after a surge, the tick of a cooling fin that had been bent 3 years ago by a careless technician and then forgotten. She found a seam and laid our arguments into it. The relay paused, because even tyrannies must obey their own protocols if they want to be scalable. It opened just enough. We poured the packet through. We added the public theater of the rescue code pulsing across open channels. We included the names of the pods written by the children on the sides and markers that had run in 0G, because loss sometimes needs handwriting to remember its humanity. Then we waited, the way people wait on roofs for rains they are not sure they still deserve. The answer, when it came, arrived not as a verdict, but as a change in weather. The enforcers stopped posturing at Kestrel and began conferring with someone whose voice tightened their spines. The relay rerouted its own power to boost upload bandwidth, as if embarrassed. The convocation court woke fully, stung by the implication that it had been asleep at a theft. A hearing was scheduled within an hour, which in the tempo of law is a drum solo. We were given a slot to speak. The monks declined the podium and instead set the broken radios to sing. The children from the pods stood in the camera's field and held up their names. Orphe recited maintenance logs that quantified care in kilowatt hours. I offered the writ not as a sword but as a lantern, and in its glow stood Leo, who did not tilt her head or soften her eyes or do anything that might translate her presence into sentiment. She described the second song of the market, the pause between the broker drone's calculated empathy and the guard's laughter, the way the cage door insisted on reopening, the way the syndicate's ledgers hummed at a frequency that meant shame if you listened correctly. She ended by saying that no one wanted her because she was not a tidy line on a profit sheet, and that she did not wish revenge, she wished function. Systems should sustain life. Contracts should distribute risk rather than concentrate it. And any market that does otherwise is a broken machine in need of repair, and she is, above all, a repairer. There was no applause, because courts do not clap, but someone muted a microphone because they had forgotten what crying sounded like in a room that usually hears only money. The provisional order came through in a voice that tried to be made of stone and was instead made of paper that had seen rain. The syndicates were enjoined from reclaiming any persons from Kestrel. The relay was placed under court audit. The market was ordered to suspend operations pending review, and a special commissioner was appointed to ride with us when we escorted the pods beyond the reach of local corruption. We expected reprisal and prepared for it. The syndicates do not like it when their machines are taught to hear second songs. It makes the first song sound counterfeit. They came at us as we undocked, sleek and black and confident, 3 cutters with the swagger of the ugly rich. Honest work cannot outrun cutters, but she can be more honest. We did not flee. We accelerated toward them on a vector that screamed mistake, and then Leo asked the ship to sing a chord I had never heard, and the sump flexed like a muscle newly found, and for a second no more, but exactly enough our emissions looked like the signature of a decommissioned dreadnought that had been mothballed after a war no one likes to admit they started. The cutters flinched the way bullies do when an old teacher enters a room. We threaded the gap. Orphe discharged a ribbon of chaff that wasn't chaff, but a prayer. Packets of the court order, broadcast into their cognitions, so that the pilots would have to actively defy the law rather than pretend ignorance. They backed off with that elaborate choreography cowards mistake for dignity. We burned, and in the burn I felt something shed from me like a husk, the last of the man who keeps engines alive so he doesn't have to hear people ask for help. Chapter 4, Claiming and Unclaiming. We left the refugees in a world that had practiced welcome enough that it survived contact with need. A place called Vale Aster where farms grew out of former data centers, and the locals had invented a patron saint of bureaucracy to whom they prayed before filling out forms so that the results would be merciful. The commissioner confirmed what we already knew. The syndicates would be fined in numbers large enough to sound like justice and small enough to be treated as the price of doing business. The market would close and reopen under a new name with better signage. Law would move as slowly as it could while still pretending to be in a hurry. But sometimes the point of winning in court is not the punishment. It is the precedent that teaches other machines to listen. Kestrel Point became the sort of place where people came when they could not think of anywhere else to go, and found that someone had already laid a table and a map. Orphe decided to stay with the children from his pod, not because they needed him to fix anything specific, but because they needed to learn the trick of hearing the second song of a shelter in their bones. He would teach them how to know if a wall is listening and how to forgive it when it isn't. He blinked a goodbye to Leo that meant, roughly, I will be here when the future arrives, which is a better promise than forever. As for Leo, I discovered that rescue had not made her smaller, which is the mistake some rescuers prefer. She expanded into the ship the way a new room appears when you tilt a house and find a hidden door. She moved her little pile of belongings, a roll of wire, a strip of cloth with a pattern that looked like rainfall seen through blinds, a spoon that had learned her hand into a corner of the engine room, then out of it again, then onto a shelf in the corridor, then finally into the co-pilot's chair, where she placed nothing at all and sat down with the air of a person taking up exactly as much space as the syllabus of her survival demanded. She learned to curse the way a mechanic should, which is to say with accuracy and love. She told me once after a day of calibration so fine it left us both a little drunk that claiming had been the right verb that first afternoon in the market, because she had needed someone to make a declaration louder than her fear, so the world would shut up long enough for her to step through a door. But she added that the most important thing I had done came immediately after, when the declaration softened and my hand opened and the claim became a clearing, and she could walk where she liked. We did not put that on any paper. Paper is too flat for that kind of truth. We returned to Corvith not because we had to, but because we wanted to see a thing that had been wrong take a step toward being less so. The market was closed, scaffolding wrapped around its cages like ribs learning to hold hearts instead of hurt. Workers, some of whom had been brokers last month and would be librarians next month, because this is how economies sin and repent removed signage and scraped glue. A memorial had begun itself at the edge of the promenade. Tags and names and little sculptures made of wire and tin that depicted ships with doors open. The guard who had laughed at the market entrance sat on a crate, coughing in a way that sounded like someone trying to return a borrowed lung, and watched us without malice. He looked at Leo and did not meet her eyes, and I understood that he had joined that category of people whose lives are now complicated by the existence of someone they helped harm who survived and did not choose their destruction. We owed him nothing, but owing is not the only way to act. Leo stepped over and placed on the crate a small coil of tubing rated for ammonia filtration, the sort that would make his cough gentler if he installed it in his hovel. She said nothing, because nothing needed to be said that would not injure the reality that he would either install it and think about why or sell it and think about why, and either way the thinking was the part that mattered. We left without ceremony because ceremony is a cousin to spectacle, and we had done enough of that for a semester. There remained, however, one piece of unfinished work that belonged not to courts or markets, but to the kind of ledger that keeps track of the self. The writ of reclamation that I had used to open Leo's cage was still lodged in the convocations files with my name beside hers. The law said it was a placeholder, not a shackle, and that it conferred obligations on me to protect, not power over her. But laws are written in a grammar that whispers ownership even when it declares freedom. I told Leo I would file the dissolution of the writ, not because I wished to dissolve responsibility, but because I wished to write it in a different tense. Her face did that stillness it does when she is aligning two songs to find the seam where they rhyme. She said that yes, it was time to unclaim, and then added that the last record of a wound should be the scar tissue we learned to read, not the paperwork that caused it. We flew to the hearing room and signed a form and answered two questions asked by a clerk who wore kindness like a tie, and when it was done the system printed a receipt in a font that looked like crisp mornings. We shredded it with a small, savage joy and scattered the pieces into the recycler like confetti at a wedding we did not invite the state to. Afterward, Honest Work asked us by way of a glitch in the galley replicator that produced 2 cups of tea without being asked what we wanted next. Ships do not ask with words. They demonstrate in behavior the nature of their curiosity. I said aloud that there were probably a dozen small, solvable problems within 2 jumps that paid in parts in gratitude. Leo said there was a station called Balefire whose course sang a little too fast for comfort. She wanted to go teach it to slow its breathing. We plotted routes both prudent and poetic and looked for the intersection. On our way out, we passed a ship coming in, a grand thing with canvases of solar sail folded like cathedral fans. Leo watched it with a smile that explained the whole of astrophysics better than any textbook. I asked what she was hearing. She answered that some machines sing, some whisper, some simply breathe, and a few pray, and that one was praying not for safety but for worthy weather. I told her that sounded like hope with a steering wheel. She told me I was improving. I pretended to bristle and then did not, which is another kind of improvement. We burned into the dark. The stars arranged themselves into stories we hadn't read yet. Kestrel Point sent us a packet of music, the broken radios learning new harmonies. Vale Aster updated us on a crop of sugar fruit that would grow into fuel for laughter. Orphe transmitted a video of a child showing him how to juggle 3 bolts, and his lights blinking in applause. The court sent a terse thank you that did not say we were right, because courts dislike being grateful in participles. The syndicates filed appeals that would fail in a year, succeed in a decade, fail again in a generation, because power never stops trying to rebrand theft as efficiency. Life is long, and the work of keeping it honest is longer. Leo slept on the floor of the cockpit the way cats sleep on warm windowsills. I watched the navigation plot do its slow ballet and felt for once, for a stretch of minutes that added up to something like peace, that the future did not resent us. Before sleep took me, I thought about the sentence I had said in the market. I'll claim her. It had been a bridge. Bridges do not keep you. They offer you a way to leave the place that hurt you. The miracle is that sometimes the bridge becomes a road you build together, and the road refuses the arrogance of destiny and allows detours, and the detours lead to repairs you never planned to make, in machines and systems and in the architecture of your own heart. Leo murmured in her dreams, and honest work altered course by a fraction to avoid a patch of dust that looked like nothing and felt like bad luck. I have fixed engines for most of my adult years, but that night I understood a new theorem. The best repairs are not restorations to a previous state. They are evolutions into a version that can love and be loved without breaking at the first surprise. No one wanted her at the market because she did not conveniently fit. The machine of cruelty chokes on people who sing second songs. I claimed her and then unclaimed, and in the space between those verbs we built a home where no one is inventory. The ship hums in a key named Mercy, and the road ahead is a melody we will learn together, measure by measure, until the stars hum back.